capable of compassion. That contradiction haunted them. But it also inspired them. Some nurses were later invited back to the United States under post-war exchange programs initiated by the Red Cross and medical institutions seeking to foster international understanding. They attended courses in public health and midwifery, learning from advancements driven by wartime necessity: mass vaccination, antibiotics, emergency transport logistics. Among them was Anna Keller, the same woman who had once served beside Lieutenant Rowan. In 1950, she walked once again through the gates of a New Jersey hospital, no longer as a prisoner, but as a guest. The same corridors that had once echoed with the clipped rhythm of boots now resonated with laughter and collaboration. To her astonishment, a few of the nurses she had worked with remembered her by name. One even handed her a faded black-and-white photograph, a group of women in uniforms, smiling awkwardly in the sunlight of 1945. Across the Atlantic, in a Germany still scarred by hunger and displacement, her colleagues were beginning to rebuild civilian healthcare networks. The influence of their American experience showed in subtle ways: emphasis on preventive medicine, structured patient documentation, the adoption of mobile clinics. Some of these innovations had originated in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, perfected in the chaos of war, and now found new life in a defeated nation's recovery. The irony was not lost on them. The conquerors' methods were helping the conquered heal, but while the physical effects of their captivity were measurable, the emotional scars were less visible. In diaries later discovered by historians, several nurses wrote about recurring dreams of the American hospitals: white walls, the steady rhythm of typewriters, the smell of antiseptic and soap. One described waking each morning and expecting to hear the distant sound of an American radio, before remembering she was back in a Germany filled with rubble and silence. For many, those years in U.S. custody had become a strange sanctuary in memory, a time of stability amid chaos, of order amid moral collapse. Their testimony eventually attracted the attention of post-war researchers compiling accounts of prisoner rehabilitation. Reports from the early 1950s described these women as remarkable subjects of moral reintegration, noting their tendency to express gratitude rather than bitterness. While many POWs spoke of humiliation and resentment, the nurses spoke of learning, of being forced to confront propaganda with personal experience. Their American captors, it turned out, had educated them not through lectures or leaflets, but through example. As the Cold War intensified, some of these nurses found themselves once again navigating ideological divides. Those in the Soviet zone were pressured to denounce the United States and publicly discredit their experiences. A few refused, facing demotion or dismissal from state hospitals. Others simply stayed silent, their memories becoming a private rebellion against the state's new narrative. In the West, however, their stories began to resurface in professional journals and nursing associations. By the 1960s, several had become instructors, teaching a new generation that medicine transcends borders and flags. One particularly moving moment came in 1965 during a Red Cross symposium in Geneva. Former German and American medical personnel, once enemies, shared a stage for the first time. Anna Keller, then in her 50s, spoke quietly before an audience of international delegates. She described how she had been captured, transported, and assigned to an American hospital during the war. Then she said, "They taught me how to use a scalpel differently. But more importantly, they taught me how to see differently." The room fell silent. It was not a speech about politics or victory, but about humanity rediscovered in the least expected place, a prisoner's ward. In later years, as documentaries and oral histories revisited the Second World War from new perspectives, a few of these women agreed to interviews. Their recollections were calm, unsentimental, yet profound. They spoke of fear and confusion, of initial mistrust, of the slow erosion of hatred through acts of everyday decency. They remembered the smell of American coffee, the sound of jazz from hospital radios, the unfamiliar taste of canned fruit, small fragments of normalcy that contrasted so sharply with the war's brutality. Those memories, they said, became proof that reconciliation was possible not in treaties, but in treatment rooms. The legacy of their captivity extended even further into the post-war alliance between the United States and West Germany. By the late 1940s, The two nations had begun cooperating closely on medical research and industrial production. Some historians suggest that the quiet professionalism and goodwill of those German nurses laid part of the emotional groundwork for that cooperation. They were living reminders that even in total war, bridges could survive the fire. As the years passed and the witnesses grew old, their stories took on an almost mythic tone among students of wartime ethics. They were neither heroes nor victims in the conventional sense, simply women who chose to heal rather than hate. Their experience illustrated that compassion, when extended even to an enemy, could become an instrument of transformation. The same women who had entered American hospitals as prisoners left them as emissaries of a new moral order. When Anna Keller died in 1987, her notebook was found among her personal effects. Inside, the inscription from Lieutenant Rowan remained legible: "Medicine has no borders." Beneath it, she had added her own words in careful handwriting: "Nor should mercy." It was a fitting epitaph for a generation of women whose captivity had redefined what it meant to be conquered and what it meant to be free. Their story, long overshadowed by the battles of men and machines, endures as a rare chapter of light amid darkness. For even in war's aftermath, when hatred seemed immortal, a handful of nurses proved that healing could outlast ideology, and perhaps that is the quietest yet greatest victory of all.